Hey guys, tonight we wander through frostbitten streets, the kind where your boots scrape against cobblestones dusted in ice, and every chimney belches clouds that taste like soot in your throat. You probably won't survive this without a shiver or two, but hey, that's the point. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and local time. It's always fun to see who's shivering along with us. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along narrow streets where fog hangs like a thick wool blanket, muting colors and swallowing sounds. Smoke from 1,000 small fires curls upward, tangling with the mist until the city feels like one massive gray cloud you're walking through. Historians still argue whether the infamous London fog was worse for health or morale, but either way, it smacks you in the lungs. Your scarf barely shields your face, and the tips of your fingers are already numb despite gloves that seem more ornamental than practical. Children dart between houses, their boots slapping icy puddles, carrying news or small parcels for neighbors. Some of them sport threadbare coats that flutter like flags in the wind. Fringe historians speculate that kids sometimes wrapped scraps of cloth around their legs, improvising thermal protection, a sort of DIY fashion statement born from desperation. You notice their eyes wide alert, but shadowed by fatigue. The cold doesn't care about age, and in Victorian London, frostbite was an uninvited guest in nearly every home. You pass a blackened brick house with smoke curling from a crooked chimney. Inside, a family huddles around a tiny hearth. One person keeps poking the fire while another adds coal, the small flames illuminating faces etched by winter hardship. Remember, coal was king, yet it carried its own dangers. Overstuffed fireplaces could ignite curtains, and inhaling too much soot could turn a mild cough into a persistent, wheezing companion. You rub your nose against the biting air and shiver, realizing that even the briefest warmth comes at a cost. The cobblestones underfoot are slick with frozen slush. One misstep, and you might land on your backside, the icy streets laughing at your clumsiness. People shout greetings or warnings, their words muffled by fog that swallows sound. Occasionally, a horse-drawn cart lumbers past, scraping ice as its iron wheels grind along, the animals steaming in the cold. You inhale deeply, half nostalgia, half survival instinct, as the mix of smoke, horse, and coal fills your senses. Improvisation is everywhere. Straw mats against drafty windows, Istra curtains, and small brick extensions around chimneys are attempts to trap what little heat the hearths provide. Historians still argue whether these tweaks genuinely improved warmth or were more about appearances and morale. You can't help but smirk. Modern central heating makes us forget how clever or desperate people had to be just to avoid freezing solid. Vendors balance iron kettles of hot tea on cobblestones, steam curling like ghostly fingers through the fog. The aroma is intoxicating, layered with hints of coal and the river nearby. You cup your hands around a steaming mug, letting heat seep into bones that feel decades older than they should. Some claim that Victorian London streets never truly warmed, not even under midday sunlight, and judging by your stiff fingers, you start to believe it. A stray dog shivers beside a doorway, its ribs visible beneath a ragged coat. You wonder if anyone has enough scraps to feed it, or if it survives, like so many humans, on sheer luck and resilience. Fringe accounts mention that dogs were sometimes used as portable warmth, curled up against children at night, a desperate measure that sounds both sweet and sad. You glance around, noticing that even the smallest warmth in these streets feels like a miracle. Passing a narrow alley, the stench of frozen refuse mingles with the faint perfume of coal fires. You see a boy stomping his feet to keep circulation alive, his thin coat flapping open, revealing a threadbare undershirt. He offers a small nod and a wry grin before disappearing into the fog. Historians still argue whether child labor was a survival mechanism or a societal failure, probably both. But, in this winter, that debate feels academic. You shiver again, adjusting your scarf, and keep moving. You spot a lamplighter, climbing a wobbly ladder, igniting a flickering gas lamp. The flame casts warm halos on ice-crusted bricks, a momentary reprieve from the gray gloom. People pause under the glow, trading brief smiles or curses at the cold. Fringe historians claim that lamplighters sometimes carried hot coals in pouches to stave off frostbite. Though that might be more romanticized legend than fact, still, imagining a glowing pouch against freezing fingers is oddly comforting. The Thames emerges through a veil of fog, black and glistening, with frozen chunks drifting lazily downstream. The river smells of decay and industry, a reminder that even nature offers no warmth here. Bridges are slick, and anyone careless enough to slip risks both injury and a dunk in near-freezing water. You imagine the hardy souls who fish, ferry, or scavenge along its banks, their breath steaming in the air as they navigate ice and muck. Finally, you arrive at a small square where a group of neighbors has gathered around a shared fire barrel. The flames crackle, throwing shadows that dance across frost-covered faces. Stories, gossip, and small laughter echo in the cold, a testament to human persistence. You sip the last of your tea, letting the warmth fill you, realizing that even in a city that seems designed to chill every bone, people find ways to survive, adapt, and share fleeting moments of comfort. The fog thickens as you move deeper into the city, curling around buildings like a living thing. You trudge past narrow alleyways, where soot-streaked walls seem to whisper secrets of lives frozen in winter's grip. The air tastes bitter, a mix of coal smoke, damp stone, and the faint temps of the Thames. Historians still argue whether the great smog of later decades was inevitable, or if Victorian urban planning could have prevented such choking conditions. But tonight, that debate feels academic as your lungs burn with each breath. Street lamps flicker weakly through the mist, their gas flames sputtering against the icy wind. You notice the residents moving quickly, collars turned up, hats pulled low. Every step seems calculated, avoiding puddles that have turned to treacherous sheets of ice overnight. Fringe accounts describe Londoners tossing horse manure and sawdust into the streets to provide traction, a messy but effective winter survival tactic. You smirk at the thought modern city maintenance would have you arrested for a fraction of that chaos. Children, unaccompanied and audacious, dart across streets, delivering newspapers or begging for coins. Some wrap themselves in scraps of fabric, creating patchwork coats that barely fend off frostbite. You see their cheeks reddened, noses running, and yet there's a certain spark in their eyes. Historians still debate whether child labor during Victorian winters was an exploitative necessity or a grim rite of passage. But in the midst of this cold, the distinction hardly matters. Survival is immediate, tangible, and merciless. The coal smoke from countless hearths mixes with the fog, creating an almost tangible haze that clings to your hair and eyelashes. People cough as they walk, the smoke seeping into lungs and clothing. You glimpse a man shaking a blanket outside a tiny tenement. Fringe sources suggest some families used repeated bedding beatings to release accumulated soot and lice, practice both ingenious and horrifying. The combination of cold, filth, and smoke makes you appreciate modern ventilation. But you remind yourself, there's a certain poetry to this harsh endurance. You pass a row of shops whose windows are fogged from the inside, offering glimpses of life beyond the icy streets. Candles flicker, casting golden halos across bread, textiles, and pots of steaming soup. The warmth feels almost mythical compared to the outside, and you pause for a moment, savoring the contrast. Historians still argue whether these small comforts significantly improved morale, but you notice the customers. Brief smiles as they exchange coins, for sustenance, a tiny rebellion against winter's oppression. Turning a corner, you encounter a frozen puddle reflecting the dim gaslight. Your boots crunch on the ice as you step carefully, watching a boy attempting to skate with improvised wooden runners strapped to his shoes. Fringe historians speculate that these impromptu skates were a common winter pastime among poor children, a rare pleasure amidst grinding hardship. You can't help but chuckle, imagining the determination required to glide on icy water in threadbare stockings and patched trousers. The smell of open fires and burnt coal follows you as you approach a slum courtyard. Families cluster around hearths in cramped rooms, smoke curling through holes in leaky roofs. You peek through a doorway and see a child's hand hovering over a tin of soup, waiting for it to cool enough to eat. Historians still argue whether slum reform efforts in the mid-19th century truly improved winter conditions or simply offered superficial relief. Either way, the reality is stark. Warmth is a precious commodity, shared sparingly and jealously. From a distance, the river glints under the dim light, frozen edges crunching beneath occasional footfalls. You watch men hauling bundles of coal, their faces red with exertion and frost. Fringe records note that some laborers would carry heated stones in their pockets, a method for keeping fingers from freezing a human solution to an elemental problem. You wonder whether you'd have the patience, stamina, or sheer stubbornness to do the same, feeling your own hands stiffen in the cold. Further along, a street vendor balances a makeshift stall on icy cobblestones. Steam rises from a kettle of mulled ale, blending with the fog. Customers gather briefly, mugs clutched tightly, exhaling warm breath that mingles with the smoky haze. Historians still debate whether street food played a crucial role in sustaining urban populations during harsh winters, or if it was merely a comfort. You sip your imaginary ale, savoring the heat that spreads through your chest, imagining the fleeting joy it brings amidst hardship. The fog seems to press against your face, each inhalation a reminder that Victorian London winters are relentless. A stray cat darts through the alley, its tail puffed like a bottle brush, hunting for scraps. Fringe tales suggest cats were sometimes used as informal heating companions for children, curled up to share precious body warmth. You shake your head with a soft laugh, thinking of the ingenuity and sheer desperation that these small creatures inspire in human survival stories. You approach a workhouse, its towering walls stark against the gray sky. Inside, the corridors are narrow, dormitories sparse, and heat minimal. Residents huddle together, whispering stories, trading scraps of clothing, sharing what warmth they can. Historians still argue whether workhouses offered protection from winter's harshness or compounded suffering through overcrowding and cold. Either way, the desperation is palpable. Every small ember of heat represents hope, however fleeting. A church bell chimes faintly, muffled by fog, marking the late hour. You notice parishioners exiting, wrapped in layers, carrying candles and whispered prayers. Fringe anecdotes describe parish volunteers distributing bread and broth, a ritualistic blend of charity and survival. You imagine the faces grim yet grateful, receiving warmth, food, and small reprieves from the unyielding cold. The interplay between human kindness and environmental cruelty seems almost poetic in its starkness. Finally, as you leave the immediate city center behind, the streets narrow further, alleys twisting like frozen veins. You take a moment to glance back at the smoky chimneys, fog-shrouded rooftops, and distant gas lamps. The reality of winter in Victorian London is clear. It is a city that demands resilience, ingenuity, and a touch of luck to endure. You shiver, but not just from cold, also from the awe of human perseverance, the strange warmth of community amidst relentless frost, and the quiet, stubborn hope that somehow people make it through. You step into the cramped interiors of Victorian slums, where narrow hallways twist between rows of soot-blackened tenements. The cold from the streets seems to seep through walls so thin they might as well be paper. and you shiver as a faint draft snakes around your ankles. Families huddle together in tiny rooms, layered like human Tetris, trying to conserve whatever heat remains from a single, sputtering fireplace. Historians still argue whether these buildings were deliberately cheapened for profit or simply a reflection of rapid urbanization. But standing here, you understand the cruel efficiency of overcrowding. Children sit cross-legged on worn wooden floors, their breath visible in the freezing air, whispering or quietly playing with scraps of cardboard or threadbare cloth. Fringe accounts mention families using bed hopping, a practice of sharing mattresses in shifts to maximize warmth, leaving no one truly comfortable but everyone marginally safer from frostbite. You notice the smells: damp wood, coal smoke, and a faint, sour tang of unwashed laundry, and it feels simultaneously alien and familiar, like a childhood memory viewed through a foggy lens. A mother stirs a small pot over the fire, the liquid hissing as it heats, filling the room with a thin aroma of bread and herbs. You glance at the father, whose hands are reddened and cracked from hauling coal earlier, the veins standing out like frozen cords beneath pale skin. Historians still debate whether family labor in slums was a survival necessity or systemic exploitation. And here, it seems almost impossible to separate the two. Every member contributes to warmth, sustenance, and survival. Yet none escape the harsh winter unscathed. You notice the walls are lined with patches of newspaper or cloth, an attempt to insulate against the chill. Fringe historians suggest some families even collected discarded curtains or old blankets from wealthier neighborhoods, fashioning a patchwork insulation system. It's inventive, desperate, and utterly human, a quiet rebellion against the cold. You can almost feel the ingenuity buzzing in the cramped space, a testament to the will to endure. The window panes are frosted over, creating crystalline patterns that catch the meager light from the fire. Outside, the street noises are muffled by ice and fog, but occasional shouts and the clatter of carts remind you that life continues even in the harshest conditions. You watch a child press a frozen hand to the glass, marveling at the delicate patterns and briefly forgetting the chill. It's a small, fleeting beauty in an otherwise merciless environment. The floorboards creak as you step lightly toward a corner where a small lamp flickers. Shadows dance across the walls, creating the illusion of movement, like ghosts of warmth trying to stretch further than the fire allows. Historians still argue whether such psychological tricks, dim lighting, storytelling, small comforts, had measurable effects on morale. But in this moment, the flickering glow seems to lift spirits. However, subtly, you notice a cat curled up near the hearth, its tail twitching occasionally. Fringe sources report that animals were often relied upon for body heat, in addition to companionship, a practice that sounds charming until you remember that warmth was scarce, and every extra body, human or animal, was a resource to be managed. The cat shifts in size, clearly content despite the cold, a small victory against winter's relentless march. Laundry hangs overhead, damp and stiff, clinging to ropes that sag under the weight. The smell of wet fabric mingles with smoke, coal, and faint human perspiration. You realize that in these rooms, every item has multiple functions: warmth, bedding, makeshift insulation, or even a way to soften frozen floorboards. Fringe historians note that Victorian families were remarkably resourceful in repurposing nearly everything to survive winter, turning scarcity into a form of domestic engineering. A young boy leans against the wall, rubbing his hands together to generate heat. His coat is patched in several places, each piece telling a story of hand-me-downs or improvised mending. Historians still debate whether these patches were purely functional or carried a subtle social statement, a way to signal resilience and thrift in a city obsessed with appearances. You can't help but admire the artistry in necessity, the quiet dignity in survival. The air feels heavier here, thick with warmth, smoke, and the faint scent of desperation. Families converse in whispers, careful not to waste vocal energy, their voices almost swallowed by the winter chills sneaking through cracks. Fringe records suggest some households developed subtle rituals, shared songs, bedtime stories, or synchronized breathing to conserve heat, a curious blend of psychology and physics. You watch a mother hum softly to her child, the sound both comforting and defiant against the icy reality. Outside, snow begins to drift lazily, settling on soot-darkened rooftops and forming delicate, transient patterns. You pause by the doorway, feeling the cold bite through your coat, and glance back at the cluster of tiny rooms where life continues in quiet determination. Historians still argue whether Victorian urban winters were more punishing due to climate, pollution, or sheer population density. But walking these alleys, you understand that it was likely all three conspiring in concert. You step out onto the icy street once more, leaving behind the warmth of the slum, yet carrying its impressions with you. The cold assaults you immediately, sharper than before, and you realize how precious that brief respite had been. Fringe accounts suggest that residents often timed brief errands or chores around the warmth of communal fires, a delicate choreography balancing necessity against exposure. You trudge onward, boots crunching, lungs stinging, feeling both humbled and oddly inspired by the resourcefulness of people who faced such harsh conditions daily. The factory whistles pierce the morning fog, a shrill reminder that even in the dead of winter, work cannot pause. You trudge along the frozen streets toward towering brick factories, their chimneys belching thick black smoke that stains the sky. Children dart between buildings, small faces red from frost and exertion, clutching tools or parcels for delivery. Historians still argue whether child labor in Victorian London was a form of economic necessity or systemic exploitation. But standing here, it feels cruelly both. You pull your scarf tighter, aware that frostbite isn't just a threat, it's an everyday hazard. The gates creak open, revealing a bustling factory yard where workers shuffle like ghosts between shifts. You see children as young as 8, hauling sacks of coal or weaving fabric in frigid rooms. Fringe records note that some families sent kids to work in part for warmth. Factories, despite their harsh conditions, were often slightly warmer than unheated homes. You shiver at the thought of standing in these drafty halls all day, fingers stiff, lungs heavy with cold dust, and feet numb in worn shoes. Inside, the air is thick with smoke and machinery noise. Steam rises from kettles and vats, creating a mist that mingles with the cold, forming miniature clouds inside the factory. You notice small injuries, scraped knuckles, red faces, and occasional bruised limbs. Fringe historians suggest some children developed calluses so thick that frostbite rarely penetrated them, a grim adaptation that seems both impressive and tragic. Historians still debate whether factory regulations of the era truly mitigated these dangers, or if enforcement was mostly symbolic, and your eyes scanned the floorboards, imagining the countless tiny accidents hidden in plain sight. You pass a weaving loom where a girl carefully guides thread through the machinery. Her fingers are chapped, her coat patched multiple times, and yet she moves with efficiency born of necessity. Small fires in cast iron stoves line the walls, but heat barely reaches the far corners of the room. Fringe accounts describe children standing on blocks to reach machinery, their feet numb, teeth chattering, and supervisors indifferent to their discomfort. You wince, noting how the human body is pushed to extremes simply to produce textiles for an indifferent market. During a brief break, workers huddle in corners, sharing cups of thin broth or tea. The liquid offers warmth, though barely enough to stave off shivers. Historians still argue whether these breaks were enough to prevent cold-related illness, or merely gestures toward humane treatment. You sip a mental cup along with them, feeling the heat trickle through your chest, marveling at the resilience required to continue working under such conditions. Outside the windows, frost clings to the glass in intricate patterns. a reminder that nature doesn't yield to labor demands. Children glance through, momentarily distracted from monotonous toil, their breath fogging the panes. Fringe historians claim some factory owners encouraged children to observe the frost patterns as a mild diversion, though whether it was a genuine morale booster or a subtle psychological manipulation is unclear. You smile at the delicate crystals, a fleeting beauty amid relentless labor. In one corner, a small group of boys handles coal deliveries, their hands raw and red from contact with icy lumps. Some wear leather gloves, others have nothing but rags wrapped around their fingers. Historians still debate whether gloves were a privilege or a rarity, but the difference between warmth and frostbite is immediately obvious. Fringe accounts note that older children sometimes share their limited protective gear with younger siblings, a quiet testament to camaraderie born from shared hardship. The air smells of hot metal, coal, and damp wool, a pungent cocktail that lingers long after leaving. You inhale, grimacing, while observing supervisors pacing the floor, their coats thicker and hands safer than those of the children. The disparity between authority and laborers is stark. Warmth is not just physical, but social, a reminder that survival is unequal in more ways than one. Historians still argue whether these social hierarchies exacerbated winter mortality among working-class children, and you feel that argument in every icy gust that creeps through unsealed doors. Lunch is served in small tins, mostly bread and watery stew. Children gather in tight circles, huddling close for shared body heat. Fringe accounts mention that some workers would use layered newspapers under clothing as extra insulation, or even wrap meals in cloth to keep warmth inside. You imagine the ingenuity required. A subtle chess game against the cold that could mean the difference between frostbite and survival. As the day drags on, fatigue mixes with cold, and the machinery's rhythm becomes hypnotic. You'll watch a boy's eyes droop as he leans against a loom, only to be nudged back to work by a sharp word. Fringe historians note that children developed astonishing endurance in these factories, but at a cost. Growth was stunted, health compromised, and the cold never fully left their bodies. You shiver, thinking about the persistence required to endure a full winter day under such conditions. By late afternoon, your fingers are stiff, your lungs wheezy, and the chill gnaws at your toes. Outside, the fog thickens again, merging with smoke from factory chimneys to form a nearly opaque curtain. Historians still debate whether the industrial winter air was more deadly than the climate itself, and looking around, you start to lean toward the harsher judgment. The combination of cold, soot, and relentless labor creates an almost tangible weight pressing down on everyone. Finally, the whistle signals the end of the shift. Children stumble out into the icy street, their breath steaming, their cheeks raw. Some run home, hoping for warmth, while others linger, waiting for chores or errands. Fringe sources suggest that many would sneak small amounts of coal or bread for siblings or neighbors, a minor theft sanctioned by necessity. You follow them for a while, marveling at the resilience, ingenuity, and stubborn courage that keeps these young bodies alive in the heart of a freezing, industrial city. You step out from the factories into streets slick with frozen muck, and the chill hits you immediately. The Thames looms nearby, gray and sluggish, chunks of ice drifting in its sluggish current. You notice the stench first, a combination of sewage, coal smoke, and decaying refuse, intensified by the stagnant winter air. Historians still argue whether London's sanitation crises were a consequence of rapid industrialization or sheer municipal negligence. But standing here, the answer feels painfully obvious. You tug your coat tighter, realizing that every inhalation carries both cold and contamination. Walkways are treacherous. Slush, ice, and horse droppings combine into a slippery mess, and you carefully navigate past piles of frozen refuse that locals call street mountains. Fringe accounts suggest that some residents would use discarded wood, broken crates, or straw to create impromptu pathways, a modest but vital effort to prevent falls. You stumble slightly and chuckle at the resourcefulness of those who literally had to pave the way, through filth and frost, to survive each day. The riverside is a hub of activity, despite the cold. Fishermen, dockworkers, and scavengers work alongside frozen canals, hauling nets, crates, or coal. Their breath rises in visible plumes, and their hands are raw, red from both cold and labor. Historians still debate whether winter labor along the Thames caused disproportionate health issues, particularly among children and the elderly. Observing these workers, it's easy to see the physical toll, their bodies contorted, faces tight with effort, and movements slowed by frost and exhaustion, alongside the working adults. Children move quickly, balancing baskets or carrying parcels. Some are tasked with collecting refuse, others selling newspapers or small trinkets to passersby. Fringe records note that these tasks, while minor, exposed children to frostbite and illness, yet they were often essential for family survival. You notice the concentration on their faces, a mixture of fear, determination, and the odd flicker of mischief, reminding you that even in harshest winters, childhood persists. The frozen rivers themselves create hazards. Occasional cracks in the ice, hidden beneath snow, threaten to swallow a careless foot or cartwheel. Fringe accounts describe daredevil youths skating on thin ice, risking near-fatal tumbles for a fleeting thrill or faster travel. You shiver imagining the cold water swallowing you without mercy, and you start to appreciate the simple solidity of the cobblestones underfoot even if they are coated in icy slush. Street markets carry a strange vitality. Vendors bundle up in layers of rags, huddled near braziers or small fires, attempting to sell bread, vegetables, or coal. Steam from kettles mixes with the cold air, creating brief, smoky halos above each stall. Historians still argue whether these markets significantly alleviated hunger or simply offered temporary relief. Watching, you notice customers tightly clutching coins, sometimes trading goods, sometimes bartering scraps, all under the unyielding weight of winter. The smell of coal smoke is pervasive. Some stalls burn it directly to provide warmth, while others rely on small fires, giving off more heat than light. Fringe historians suggest that some vendors would secretly hoard extra coal to trade or sell at premium prices during cold snaps. A small but telling example of human opportunism amidst suffering. You chuckle wryly, imagining modern capitalism's roots gold, soot-stained, and smelling faintly of fish. Nearby, a frozen canal serves as both highway and playground. Children attempt to slide on ice patches, their laughter rising above the harsh groan of carts and hooves. Fringe accounts hint that these frozen waterways doubled as skating rinks, delivery routes, and hazards all at once. You pause, watching a small boy lose balance and recover with a triumphant grin, the brief joy cutting through the omnipresent gloom. Historians still debate whether such moments of play were psychologically critical for resilience, but it's hard to argue with the happiness in those small, shivering faces. Sanitation is a persistent nightmare. Frozen sewage and overflowing cesspools create both odor and danger, particularly to the young and infirm. Some families dug small channels to direct waste away from their doorsteps, while others simply learned to step carefully. Fringe records describe imaginative methods of cleaning, like using straw to soak up slush, or layering newspapers across floors to trap moisture and muck. You can't help but admire the ingenuity, even as you wrinkle your nose at the stench. The Thames itself is a living menace. Ice chunks scrape against docks, threatening both workers and the vessels they load. Fringe historians note that many small boats capsized in winter due to unseen ice, often with cargo and livelihoods lost. You imagine the courage required to navigate such hazards daily, the physical exertion magnified by biting winds and the constant awareness that a single misstep could mean disaster. Passing a narrow street, You glimpse a family huddled near a brazier in a doorway, sharing body warmth while roasting small fish. Historians still argue whether such informal street hearths truly saved lives or simply provided temporary comfort. But for the people here, it doesn't matter. The heat is real, even if fleeting. You inhale the smoky, savory aroma and feel a pang of gratitude for modern stoves, realizing how extraordinary simple warmth must have felt. Finally, you turn from the riverside back toward the city's interior, your boots crunching over icy cobbles. Children scurry past, adults shuffle slowly, and the fog thickens, muting even the shouts of vendors. Fringe accounts suggest that many residents memorized alternate routes each winter, a survival skill ensuring minimal exposure to ice, water, or foul canals. You marvel at such careful planning, noting that winter in Victorian London was a full-time occupation, demanding both cunning and endurance. A cough escapes your lips as you move deeper into the foggy streets, the cold air cutting through your scarf like a knife. Winter illnesses in Victorian London were as common as coal smoke. Influenza, bronchitis, and simple colds could escalate quickly, especially in the overcrowded slums. Historians still argue whether urban pollution or poor nutrition contributed most to seasonal death rates, but it's clear that frost and filth were lethal partners. You glance at children rubbing red, chapped hands, and wonder how many will survive this biting season without lingering ailments. Houses reek of damp, mold, and stale air. You step carefully to avoid puddles of frozen sewage, noting how water and waste would collect around doorways, sometimes freezing solid overnight. Fringe accounts claim that some families placed straw or scrap cloth over frozen puddles, creating tiny insulated pathways. It's both ingenious and heartbreaking creativity, born of necessity, in a city that barely acknowledges its poor. You shiver, thinking of how a simple winter walk could turn treacherous for the unwary. You pass a small apothecary, where a thin woman sells dubious remedies to huddled customers. Bottles of miracle elixirs promise to cure chills, coughs, and everything in between. Fringe sources mention ingredients ranging from the harmless, like herbs and honey, to the bizarre, like crocodile fat or powdered bones. Historians still debate how effective Victorian medicine really was, but judging by the line of desperate faces outside, hope and belief often mattered more than actual efficacy. You imagine sipping a concoction of dubious origin, feeling the mental comfort even if your body remains frigid. Children cough and sneeze as they run errands, their coats insufficient against the icy wind. Fringe accounts suggest some street urchins would secretly share herbal pastes with friends, a mix of kindness and folk medicine that may or may not have helped. You notice a boy pressing a cloth soaked in vinegar to his chest, a makeshift remedy meant to ward off fever. Historians still argue whether such measures were widespread or isolated instances of ingenuity. Either way, survival often depended on these small, improvisational acts. The smell of smoke from chimneys mingles with the earthy temps of winter mud, creating a pungent, almost suffocating atmosphere. You watch families huddle near small fires in the corners of their homes, sharing scraps of food, warmth, and human contact. Fringe historians note that even minimal fire exposure could dramatically reduce cold-related deaths, but fuel scarcity meant that many families went hours, sometimes days, without proper heat. You rub your hands together, realizing that warmth was not just comfort, it was life insurance. Nearby, a street vendor offers small loaves of bread, their crusts hard from frost but still edible. Customers exchange coins and whispers, moving quickly to avoid lingering in the open air. Historians still debate whether street food meaningfully mitigated winter starvation or simply offered minor sustenance. But watching the transactions, you recognize that every crumb counts. Fringe records even suggest that some vendors doubled as informal health advisors, dispensing both food and rudimentary remedies to those desperate enough to ask. A mother carries a child, wrapped in multiple layers of ragged clothing. The little one's cheeks are red, nose running, and eyes wide with discomfort. Fringe accounts indicate that parents sometimes placed warmed stones near infants to stave off hypothermia, a technique both practical and risky. You feel a pang of empathy, imagining the tension of protecting a child against relentless frost while lacking proper heat. Historians still argue whether Victorian parenting techniques during winter were primarily protective or forced by sheer necessity. And standing here, the answer seems blurred. You pass a group of street cleaners, shoveling snow and ice to keep passageways clear. Their breaths fog in the air, bodies moving in rhythm against the cold. Fringe historians describe some of these workers wearing layers of newspaper undercoats or inside gloves to survive prolonged exposure, a makeshift insulation that seems both brilliant and painfully insufficient. You imagine yourself performing this back-breaking labor, boots squelching through icy slush, muscles stiff, lungs burning, and feel a shiver run down your spine. The fog seems to thicken as you approach a workhouse infirmary. Inside, patients lie on straw-strewn floors, wrapped in whatever blankets are available. Doctors make rounds with a brisk efficiency, diagnosing coughs and fever, while doing little to address the underlying cold or overcrowding. Historians still argue whether these institutions truly provided care or merely contained illness. Fringe sources report that some workers would secretly trade small comforts, extra blankets, warm broth, or even hot stones to those deemed most vulnerable. You pause to imagine the relief a single heated stone could provide against the pervasive chill. Outside, frozen puddles reflect the dim light of gas lamps, broken by the silhouettes of hurried pedestrians. A boy slips, narrowly catching himself on the edge of a frozen cart, and you wince, noting how fragile survival can be in these conditions. Fringe historians note that quick reflexes, local knowledge, and improvisation were as essential as warmth or nourishment. You begin to appreciate the sheer physical literacy required to navigate icy streets daily without injury or illness. You glimpse a small herbal stall tucked between larger shops, where dried leaves, roots, and powders promise relief from winter maladies. A child timidly hands over a coin, eyes hopeful, while a woman instructs on dosage with whispered authority. Historians still debate whether folk remedies had measurable health benefits or simply provided psychological comfort. But for those exposed to frost and filth, belief often mattered as much as medicine. You imagine sipping a bitter herbal tea, warmth spreading through chest and mind alike. Finally, you pause at a street corner where neighbors huddle near a shared brazier, hands cupped around flickering flames. The heat is minimal, but precious, a brief reprieve from the pervasive cold. Fringe records mention that these communal warming points were vital survival strategies, places for gossip, barter, and tiny joys amidst relentless frost. Historians still argue whether these informal gatherings materially reduced winter mortality or simply boosted morale. But standing here, the warmth feels undeniable. You inhale, savoring both heat and the quiet resilience etched into each shivering face, and realize that survival in Victorian London's winter depended on ingenuity, shared effort, and sheer stubbornness. You shuffle along toward the poorer quarters, and the streets grow narrower, darker, and somehow even colder. The slums of Victorian London in winter feel less like a neighborhood and more like a labyrinth carved from misery. Brick buildings lean in too close, their walls damp, their windows cracked or stuffed with rags to keep out drafts. Historians still argue whether slum design was the result of careless landlords or simply the uncontrolled sprawl of industrial growth. But either way, you feel the weight of the walls pressing in. The air barely stirs, trapping cold like a cruel jailer. You duck into one of the narrow quartz-tiny yards crammed with families. Smoke drifts sluggishly out of a crooked chimney, and the smell of boiled cabbage mixes with the sharper temps of coal dust. Fringe accounts describe families placing pots of onions near doorways, believing the bulbs could absorb sickness and ward off winter fevers. Whether effective or not, the pungent odor dominates the tiny courtyard, and you imagine every breath stinging the eyes. Inside these rooms, overcrowding is staggering. You see up to a dozen people huddled in a single chamber, layered in blankets and ragged coats, pressed together for warmth. Historians still debate whether proximity truly reduced hypothermia or simply spread illness faster. Watching a coughing man turn his face toward the wall while children curl up beside him, you suspect the latter. Still, the closeness has its comfort, sir. Reminder of togetherness when everything outside is hostile. In some corners, you glimpse water trickling from burst pipes, freezing into jagged stalactites along stone walls. The floor beneath is slick with ice, making even the act of walking hazardous. Fringe records mention residents breaking up frozen sewage with shovels or axes, just to keep passageways clear. You tread carefully, realizing that slipping here isn't just embarrassing, it could mean injury without hope of proper treatment. The slums have their own economy. Vendors wander through with baskets of coal chips, bits of firewood, or small tins of oil. A woman calls out prices, her voice hoarse from cold, while children chase behind, hoping to scavenge a dropped piece. Historians still argue whether this microtrade alleviated suffering or merely deepened dependence, but the sight makes it clear everyone is scrambling for crumbs of warmth. You watch one boy pocket a stray lump of coal with a grin, his prize tucked like treasure beneath his shirt. A surprising detail catches your eye: windows painted over with tar or newspaper. Fringe accounts suggest this was a winter tactic to block drafts when glass was missing or broken. The effect leaves homes dim and claustrophobic, lit only by weak candles or flickering lamps. You pause, trying to imagine daily life with barely any sunlight piercing through. Every hour a blend of gloom and chill. The stench here is worse than on the main streets. Refuse piles freeze in grotesque mounds, and sewage seeps from broken drains, hardening into icy ridges. Yet people move through it with a grim efficiency. Children tiptoe along walls, women lift skirts clear of muck, and men drag carts carefully over icy stones. Historians still debate whether these slum conditions were tolerated out of neglect or because officials saw no alternative. You, meanwhile, marvel at the sheer resilience of bodies that rise each day to confront both cold and filth. You turn a corner and see something more startling: makeshift shelters cobbled together from crates, tarps, and spare boards. Inside, whole families huddle around small fires, smoke escaping through cracks. French historians describe how abandoned lots became clusters of winter shanties, dismantled when weather eased. You kneel, peering into one such shelter, noting the faces inside, tired, weary, but alive. For them, this little shack is as critical as any palace. The slums have their own kind of community. You notice neighbors sharing bowls of broth, passing small coals from one brazier to another, and swapping worn clothes. Historians still argue whether this solidarity genuinely improved survival rates or simply made hardship bearable. But the laughter of two children tossing snow at each other suggests that, even here, joy survives. You find yourself smiling, despite the cold, at how humanity insists on small celebrations, even in the bleakest places. Rats scurry near refuse heaps, their furs slick and glistening in the frost. Some children chase them for sport, others capture them for meals when desperation peaks. Fringe accounts describe rat stews passed off as rabbit or other game, a dark reminder of how hunger warps necessity. You suppress a grim chuckle, realizing that in this world, even pests had their place in the winter economy. You catch the sound of musica fiddles scraping out a tune. A man stands at a corner, bow moving steadily, while neighbors clap hands in rhythm. The melody carries, thin and defiant, above the coughing and cries. Historians still argue whether music and storytelling were survival tools or mere distraction. But as you listen, it feels like both. The tune warms the spirit, a fire you can carry without fuel. At the edge of the slums, you glimpse charity workers delivering blankets and bread. Fringe records suggest that some organizations prioritized distribution during Christmas, when the symbolism of generosity mattered most. Whether motivated by faith, guilt, or politics, the gifts are accepted with eager hands. You watch a child wrap herself in a scratchy wool blanket, her grin wide as though it were silk. In that moment, survival seems not only possible, but radiant with tiny victories. You leave the cramped alleys behind. Though the stench and chill linger, the slums have etched themselves in your Minda landscape where ingenuity and suffering intertwine, where warmth is treasure, and where laughter still flickers in shadows. As you step back onto the wider street, you can't help but feel humbled by the quiet strength of those who endure Victorian London's winter from within its coldest corners. Your footsteps echo as you approach a broader avenue, where the slums fade into rows of workhouses and charity halls. These buildings loom large, brick fortresses meant to contain poverty rather than cure it. The air is sharp, and the iron gates glisten with frost. Historians still argue whether workhouses were lifelines or prisons, but in winter, they stand as both shelter from the cold and cages of despair. You slip inside the gates, greeted by the dull clang of boots on stone floors. The main hall is cavernous and dim, filled with rows of shivering figures, seated at long wooden tables. The smell is a blend of boiled gruel, damp clothing, and smoke that barely hides the undertone of sickness. A clerk's voice cuts across the room, announcing rations for the day. Fringe accounts describe the portions as laughably small thin broth, a crust of bread, maybe a scrap of cheese if fortune smiled. You glance at the bowls being ladled out, steam rising faintly, and feel your stomach twist in sympathy. Men and women are separated, children divided by age. You hear the quiet sniffles of little ones, adjusting to the chill and absence of family comfort. Historians still debate whether such segregation was moral protection or administrative cruelty. But standing here, it feels like the coldest cut of all. A child clutches a ragged doll, eyes darting across the room in search of a parent, only to be herded along by an attendant. You breathe out slowly, trying to steady your own heart. The dormitories are lined with narrow cots, blankets threadbare, windows frosted from within. Breath hangs in the air like mist, as dozens of bodies shift restlessly in sleep. Fringe records suggest that some inmates stuffed straw into pillowcases or under thin mattresses, desperate to trap heat. You run your hand along one cot hard, unwelcoming, more like a prop in a play than a place to rest. Sleep here must feel less like recovery and more like surrender. Illness spreads quickly within these walls. A cough echoes, followed by another, and soon the dormitory becomes a chorus of discomfort. Historians still argue whether workhouse infirmaries alleviated or worsened the spread of disease. Doctors dispense tonics, their faces weary, their remedies often ineffective. You spot one worker sneaking an extra spoonful of broth to a frail elder, a tiny rebellion against rationing. Fringe accounts suggest such acts of compassion were both common and punishable. Risks some workers took anyway. Humanity smoldering beneath bureaucracy. The daily routine is rigid. Work, eat, rest, repeat. Even in the freezing cold, inmates are marched out to labor breaking stones, scrubbing floors, or sewing garments. You picture the sting of icy wind on fingers raw from washing linens in cold water. Historians still debate whether the labor was meant as moral discipline or simply economic exploitation. You suspect the answer is both, a bitter cocktail that leaves no sweetness behind. Not all who seek shelter are accepted. A group gathers outside the gates, pleading for admission. Their breath fogs in the night air, their hands outstretched. Some are turned away, their numbers too great for the capacity within. Fringe records recall families choosing to remain together on the streets, rather than be split apart in the workhouse. You imagine the heartbreak of such a choice, warmth at the cost of family, or frost together in freedom. Neither feels like salvation. Inside, the chapel offers a different kind of reprieve. Wooden pews creak under weary bodies, and candles flicker in the cold draft. Hymns rise in ragged voices, each note a fragile plea against despair. Historians still argue whether faith genuinely comforted workhouse inmates or merely dulled the sting of their suffering. As you listen, though, the harmony carries a strange warmth, filling the hollow space with something that feels bigger than gruel or stone. Walls. Fringe anecdotes mention inmates smuggling in small tokens, family trinkets, scraps of letters, or even bits of colt, to cling to dignity in a place designed to erase individuality. You notice a man fingering a worn pocket watch, its chain broken, its time long stopped. For him, perhaps it holds more heat than any brazier. You smile faintly, realizing how survival is sometimes less about body and more about spirit. At mealtime, laughter occasionally ripples through the hall. Someone cracks a joke about the gruel being extra crunchy today. And even in the bleakest of spaces, heads lift, lips curl, and eyes gleam. Historians still debate whether humor was resistance or resignation, but to you, it's clearly a spark, a reminder that no system can fully suppress the human will to find light, even in the coldest corners. When night falls, you step back outside into the frosty street. The workhouse stands behind you, lit dimly by lanterns, its outline stark against the winter fog. You feel conflicted, grateful for its shelter, horrified by its costs. The gates clang shut, and you're back in the open city, your breath visible in the dark. The street stretches ahead, empty and waiting, the cold wrapping around you like a second skin. Survival, you realize, is never simple. In Victorian London, it's a game of compromise, endurance, and sometimes impossible choices. Your boots crunch against ice-crusted cobblestones as you wander toward one of London's bustling markets. Even in winter, the streets are alive with trade, though the cold paints every face with weariness. You hear the sharp call of vendors, the creak of cartwheels, and the hollow clang of coins, all muffled by the fog. Historians still argue whether Victorian markets served as lifelines for the poor or exploitative traps of inflated prices. But either way, they throb with desperate energy. Stalls lean haphazardly against each other, wooden frames draped in tarps, stiff with frost. You brush your hand across one and feel the icy texture, brittle as old parchment. The goods themselves look tired, carrots shriveled, apples bruised, fish stiffed from the chill. Fringe accounts suggest that some sellers even used the freezing air as natural preservation, leaving meat and fish exposed overnight to keep them fresh. You wrinkle your nose, unsure whether that's clever ingenuity or an invitation to stomachache. A baker's stall radiates faint warmth, the loaves stacked like small bricks of survival. Steam curls from a tray of hot rolls, drawing a huddle of customers forward. Coins change hands quickly, each buyer clutching bread as though it were gold. You recall that mainstream records show bread riots erupting in harsher winters when prices rose beyond reach. Watching the eager faces, you realize these loaves aren't just food, they're hope wrapped in crust. Not all vendors offer necessities. A man hawks roasted chestnuts, the aroma drifting temptingly through the frigid air. Children gather around, eyes wide, hands cupped for warmth above his brazier. Fringe records describe chestnut sellers as unofficial winter heroes, their fires doubling as community heaters for anyone lingering nearby. You smile, imagining how many frozen fingers have thawed over those glowing embers, while buyers debated whether to spend their last pennies on a treat. Further down, a butcher lays out cuts of meat, their surfaces glistening like marbled stone. Historians still argue whether winter diets in poor districts included enough protein or relied too heavily on bread and tea. Here, you see the answer in the eyes of onlookers. They gaze longingly at the meat, but few step forward with coins. One woman barters instead, offering scraps of cloth in exchange for bones, which will flavor broth and stretch into meals. It's resourcefulness, dressed as desperation. But it works. You stop at a fishmonger's stall, where herring and eels lie in neat rows, their bodies frozen stiff. Fringe accounts note that eels were considered a winter staple for the working poor, cheap, plentiful, and resilient to freezing. The seller hacks through icy piles with practiced ease, his knife ringing against wood. You watch a boy scurry off with a paper-wrapped bundle, his grin suggesting tonight's supper will feel like a feast. Markets also serve as gathering places. You overhear gossip about coal shortages, rumors of influenza spreading through the docks, and whispers of charity soup kitchens opening nearby. Historians still debate whether these markets acted more as social hubs or economic lifelines, but in winter, they are clearly both. The chatter blends with the creak of carts and clop of hooves, weaving a tapestry of survival. At one stall, candles glow faintly, their wax dribbling onto wood. Light is as much a commodity as food, and families debate whether to spend coins on flame or fuel. Fringe records describe families rationing candles down to the final stub, saving them for illness, night work, or moments of celebration. You picture a family huddled around a single flickering wick, stretching its glow as though it were a banquet. Street musicians appear even here, fiddlers and hurdy-gurdy players scraping out tunes to entice coins. Their breath clouds the air, their fingers red but nimble. One launches into a jaunty jig, and children break into laughter, stomping their feet in rhythm on icy stones. Historians still argue whether such entertainment offered real escape or simply disguised hardship with temporary joy. Watching the smiles spread, though, you feel warmth that has nothing to do with coal or fire. Not all sights are cheerful. Beggars line the market edges, hands outstretched, their pleas drowned by vendor calls. Some clutch infants swaddled in rags, others huddle under shawls, stiff with frost. Fringe accounts claim that markets were both a blessing and a curse. For beggars, more people meant more potential alms, but also more competition. You drop an imaginary coin in a child's hand and feel a strange pang, knowing survival here often hinged on the kindness of strangers. As daylight fades, lanterns flicker to life, their glow refracted by the fog. The market takes on a new character, shadows stretching long, goods gleaming in the muted light. A vendor calls out the last bargains of the night: bruised apples, stale bread, and leftover fish. Families scramble, clutching what they can afford, for tomorrow the prices may rise again. Historians still debate whether this end-of-day scramble was more chaotic in winter than in summer, but the desperation you see leaves little room for doubt. Finally, you step away, ears still buzzing with shouts and laughter, eyes lingering on the last traces of steam rising from braziers. The market is both heart and stomach of Victorian London, in winter a place where hunger meets ingenuity, where coins and kindness mix uneasily, and where survival is bartered day by day, bite by bite. The deeper you wander into the winter night, the louder the city's shadows seem to whisper. For all the markets, workhouses, and slums you've seen, London also hides a darker undercurrent crime that thrives in the cold. The fog hangs thick, swallowing gaslight and muffling footsteps. Perfect cover for anyone willing to take what others barely cling to. Historians still argue whether crime spiked during the winter months due to desperation, or whether it was simply more visible in the gloom. But either way, you feel your pockets instinctively tighten. A group of ragged boys darts past you, laughing as one clutches a loaf of bread. The baker's furious shouts fade quickly into the fog. You realize you've just witnessed a snatch, a common petty theft of the time. Fringe accounts suggest some gangs of child thieves trained under older criminals, learning how to slip through crowds unseen, watching their thin legs disappear into the dark. You almost admire their speed, though. The punishment, if caught, would be brutally disproportionate. You pass beneath a narrow archway and spot a figure leaning against the wall, offering matches for sale. At first glance, she looks like a poor vendor. Then you notice her eyes darting, scanning for opportunity. Fringe historians note that some street sellers doubled as pickpockets, using wares as distraction. The thought makes you check your coat buttons, though you remind yourself this is just imagination. You're safe in your bed, even if your heart's beating as though you're not. The alleys are alive with whispers. A man offers coal at half price from a hidden stash, likely stolen from a delivery cart. Another hawks hot pies that smell suspiciously like rat. You chuckle under your breath, grimly amused that Victorian London was the birthplace of fast food scams too. Historians still debate how widespread food adulteration was, but chalk, sawdust, and a lem found their way into bread often enough that eating could feel like gambling. Near the docks, silhouettes cluster around a brazier, faces half-lit, exchanging goods in the flicker. Knives gleam briefly before vanishing into belts. Fringe accounts describe winter dockside smuggling as particularly lucrative. Fewer patrols ventured into the biting wind, leaving criminals free to shift barrels of contraband gin or tobacco. You pause, imagining the clash of cold Thames air and the warmth of illicit liquor, and understand why risks felt worth it. Prostitution, too, takes on harsher tones in the winter. Women stand at corners wrapped in shawls, voices soft but insistent. Historians still argue whether this was primarily survival work or a result of systemic neglect. But either way, the cold makes every offer edged with urgency. Some fringe stories suggest women rubbed whiskey on their skin to fight the chill while waiting for clients, a sting that must have burned almost as much as the icy air. You pull your collar high, both out of sympathy and a faint embarrassment. The police are out, their boots heavy on the stones, truncheons tapping in rhythm, but the fog is their enemy, swallowing their lanterns whole. Fringe anecdotes claim some constables lit cigars, not just for warmth, but as makeshift beacons to avoid losing each other in the haze. You can almost picture their glowing tips floating like fireflies, tiny warnings to scatter for anyone with thievery on their mind. Yet, crime isn't only theft and vice. Acts of kindness blur with illegality. A boy steals coal, not for profit, but to warm his siblings. A girl pockets apples to feed her grandmother. Historians still debate whether desperation excused such acts. But in the icy grip of London's winter, morality becomes slippery as the cobblestones underfoot. You wonder how you'd fare, whether you'd cling to rules or bend them just enough to survive. A sudden shout startles you. A man chases another down the lane, curses echoing into the fog. The fugitive vanishes, leaving only the hollow rhythm of footsteps behind. You feel the tension crackle in the air, the way winter sharpens every sound and every fear. Fringe accounts describe neighbors barricading doors with furniture during crime spikes, not trusting thin locks against desperate hands. You tug your coat tighter, suddenly grateful for modern deadbolts. The final stretch of winter in Victorian London doesn't feel like triumph, feels like endurance. You wake one morning to find frost creeping across the inside of your window, the glass etched like lace by an invisible hand. Your breath rises in clouds, and for a moment, you lie still, debating whether leaving the warmth of your blanket cocoon is worth it. Historians still argue whether February or March was harsher for Londoners, since late frosts often mocked those who thought spring was near. Either way, the city never gave relief easily. Stepping outside, you notice how pale faces have become. Weeks of thin meals and cold nights leave cheeks hollow, eyes ringed, coughs rattling in every alley. Fringe accounts describe children's lips turning blue while they waited in bread lines, their tiny bodies shivering in oversized coats handed down too many times. You wince at the image, realizing survival was as much about endurance of hunger as it was endurance of weather. Work continues, of course. In the factories, the rhythm of clanking iron and hissing steam feels endless. Workers are paler, slower, sometimes collapsing mid-shift. Overseers bark them back into motion. Historians still debate whether Victorian employers reduced expectations in harsh weather or pushed even harder to meet demand. You know which version your tired legs believe, but not all is despair. Communities cling fiercely to what joy they can muster. At night, families huddle around a rare hot stew, sharing laughter as eagerly as warmth. Fringe stories tell of neighbors pooling scraps to bake a communal pie, each adding a little some carrots, a pinch of salt, even a bone for broth. Imagine the relief of tasting something hearty after weeks of stale bread. You smile, realizing kindness was as much a survival tool as coal. The church bells call people in from the fog, their tones softened by snow. Inside, candles glow and hymns rise, giving voice to hopes that winter will soon break. You stand among the congregation, noticing how worn boots shuffle on cold stone, but also how the singing swells, stronger than hunger. Historians still argue whether faith kept people alive more than food during these bleak months, but hearing those voices, you suspect the answer leans toward yes. Street corners continue to host entertainers, singers, even a one-man band with cymbals strapped to knees. Children laugh, their breath puffing white in the gaslight. And for a moment, the city feels less like a machine grinding people down and more like a community holding itself together. You toss an imaginary coin and feel the satisfaction ripple outward. Even so, tragedy lingers. Funeral processions wind through icy lanes more frequently in these months. Black cloth draped over horse-drawn carriages, mourners wrapped in veils, their tears freezing on cheeks. Fringe accounts note that some gravediggers salted the earth to break through frost, their spades sparking against frozen clumps. You shudder, thinking how the cycle of life and death itself had to adjust to the merciless cold. And yet, spring whispers faintly at the edges. You notice snowdrops pushing through cracks in courtyards, a green bud on a branch along the Thames. The air, though still sharp, carries a hint of softness. People notice too their steps a little quicker, their faces turned upward. Historians still debate whether the relief of spring was stronger in London than rural areas, since city winters were harsher with smoke and crowding. But you can feel it, the collective sigh of survival. Finally, you trudge back through the fog-laced streets one last time, pulling your coat tight, imagining how it must have felt to live like this year after year. The soot, the cold, the hunger, the small joyous cycle, repeating until it wore people down. And yet, they did endure. Somehow, despite the hardship, they built families, wrote songs, dreamed of better tomorrows. You smile faintly, realizing you've been warmed not by coal, but by the stubborn spark of human resilience. The story of Victorian London's winters lingers in your thoughts, like the last curl of fog after dawn. The harshness you've walked through, smoke-filled lungs, frost-bitten fingers, the endless grind of survival could feel overwhelming. Yet, if you slow your breathing now, you'll notice something softer beneath it all. A thread of resilience, woven through every cough, every candlelit gathering, every small kindness passed hand to hand. Close your eyes, and imagine the city easing into spring, the fog lifting, leaving clean blue sky above chimney pots, children laughing as they chase one another through puddles left by melted snow, market stalls brightening again with oranges, onions, and bunches of early flowers. The heaviness of winter slowly replaced by a gentler rhythm of warmth, light, and renewal. Feel your body relax with that change. The cold, the hunger, the ache all drifting away like steam from a teacup. You are not walking cobblestones anymore. You are here, safe, wrapped in the stillness of your own space, with only the hum of the present surrounding you. Let the sounds of Victorian London fade to silence. Let the fog dissolve, the harsh winds soften, and the long nights shorten into brighter mornings. In their place, hold on to the calm of knowing that every season ends, every hardship eases, and every storm eventually gives way to quiet skies. Breathe deeply, rest easily. You've traveled through the winter and come out the other side.